This week, we air our third pre-recorded segment called Say Easy, Do Hard. Inspired by my co-host, Jason Albuquerque, we get our hands dirty and debate the future of the CISO role. Is it a true C-level executive position, or will it atrophy back to a vice president or a director-level position? Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
According to the 2022 Data Breach Investigations Report, the human remains the number one driver of breaches today, demonstrating that cybersecurity is no longer just a technical challenge, but a human one as well. But how do you manage the human risks of cybersecurity? It starts with measurement. Only by effectively quantifying human risk can organizations engage employees with relevant activities to truly change human behavior. That's human risk management. Map key human behaviors to the business risks that matter most to your organization for free by visiting securityweekly.com/living security. Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 312, recorded June 26, 2023, but will air on July 17, 2023. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me remotely for this segment are my co-hosts. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque, the inventor of this segment.
I'm the OG Say Easy, Do Hard. No, I'm glad we're doing this because it's much needed conversations and, why not tackle them?
Of course. Also joining remotely from the great state of Texas, Mr. Ben Carr. Welcome, Ben.
Hello, guys. Good to be with you again and looking forward to this session.
Awesome. And last but not least, from the state of Idaho, Mr. Tyler Robinson. Welcome, Tyler.
Thanks, Matt. Super excited, and we're going to do some hard things.
Yes, we are.
We'll do them easily.
Yes, the Say Easy part is join us at an upcoming official cybersecurity summit in a city near you. This series of one-day invitation-only executive-level conferences are designed to educate senior cyber professionals on the latest threat landscape. We are pleased to offer our listeners $100 off admission when you use code SECWEEK23 to register. Visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity summit to learn more and register today. All right, gentlemen, so let's get into this topic. So over the past, weeks, probably been months now, we've been seeing a lot of these interesting articles that we've been covering on the show around just the future of the CISO role. One that caught my eye right before RSA conference was one of the sessions was talking about how less than half of the Fortune 500 actually have a CISO listed on their executive team. And that kind of shocked me at first, right? I was like, well, wait a minute. Why is that the case? Like, is the CISO not considered an executive level role? And then there's been other articles kind of hinting at the same thing. So what I want to start this first segment talking about is the CISO a C-level executive position or not? And then when we get into the second segment, we'll talk about, well, if it is an executive level position, let's talk about its requirements. But let's start with the first discussion, which is it a C-level position?
Yeah. So Matt, is the question, is it or should it be?
I guess that's a great distinction, Ben. I think I would argue today that it's, for most cases, it's not. And you could make an argument that it should be. And so I think I want to debate a little bit of both of that, Ben, because I think it's interesting. Like, some people think it is an executive level position today. I would argue that that's probably not true. And it could go one of two ways. It could be in the future, or maybe it isn't. Like, I've got precedents on other executives, right? So I think it would be interesting to kind of open up the discussion, look at both case scenarios.
First of all, we need to realize that not every organization is operating under the same rules. right? So some organizations have a strategic CISO that's sitting at the table having those conversations. Is it, is it something that I think is widespread across the industry? No, absolutely not. And some CISOs are still kind of playing that technologist role, and they're not strategic, and they're still seen as a technology issue. But there are instances where CISOs are a strategic executive sitting at the table. Should that be the question on the table? Is should that be the norm?
We talked about this in our previous episode, right? Where we said every company is now a technology company.
Yep.
So if you're a technology company, security risks are real. So then the question becomes the role of the CISO and that conversation of security and the alignment to risk management. Is that considered an executive level strategic position under those circumstances? And I would say yes, but I don't know that that is the common understanding of that role yet.
And this is it, right? I firmly believe that the responsibilities that the CISO has today should sit at an executive level. Is the title of that person CISO? That's debatable. Because if you think about the responsibility of today's CISO, it's not just technology, it's not just cybersecurity. I mean, CISOs are talking about business enablement, mergers and acquisitions, right? Strategic CISOs are. They're talking about business continuity and disaster recovery. They're talking about business intelligence. They're having conversations around physical security, overall business risk management, governance, research and development. That's far beyond the original responsibilities of the CISO of the 2000s, the early 2000s, right? I mean, we've come a long way. We've taken on a lot more responsibilities.
Right? Yeah, the legacy of being associated with IT and being an IT level leader, right? Not a C-level executive. Right. And you brought up a good point, like, should they be an executive or should it should that task should be under an executive? But the question is, which executive should it sit under?
Yeah,
it's the CISO. Then that should be a C-level. That should be a C-level role. And I've had this interesting discussion with recruiters right now, and it is weird. The market's very strange. It would appear that there are a lot of companies kind of stepping back and kind of shuffling things, and some of those roles are being handed out to VPs or directors, and they're kind of making decisions, but they're still using that title of CISO because I think when a third-party event goes down and that vendor's then called to task on it, they're expected to have the CISO be responsible, but they're next on the line and they're expected to speak for it, but they don't actually have the responsibility or authority, more importantly, to get stuff done and affect that change within the company. And so I think it's a really interesting dynamic. I think there's a lot of organizations that give out that title, but their expectations and who it's reporting to is not really. They're not treating it as an executive or part of the conversation. And that's when I'm talking to a company, that's one of my first conversations, and it should be every person aspiring for that role or working in that role. Like, what is the actual reporting structure? What is the function? And all too often I've heard, well, really doesn't report to the CEO because he doesn't have time. Okay, so it's one of your, and if you ask them, like, what level, what's the risk of cyber in your organization? Where does it fall strategically? Is it 1, 2, or 3? Most often the answer is yes. If it's 1, 2, or 3 and the CEO doesn't have time for it, that should raise a lot of questions.
Right. So you're in it right now. You're having those conversations. So
I'm in the mix.
Actually you're seeing the backpedaling happen.
Yeah, I'm seeing it in the market. I've talked to recruiters. I've talked to other peers who have been, who are not in that role anymore, and they're telling me that they've been backfilled with somebody who's was on their staff or was a director, right, level under them, and they're giving them that C-level title.
And more tactical than
totally.
Yeah. It's a crazy environment that we're in, Ben, because if you think about that, the expectations and the accountability on CISOs is exponentially growing, right? Because if the stuff goes down, the target's on the CISO's back, and we're going to talk about that today. But the authority is so sorely lacking, and now you're telling me it's starting to get worse. Less and less authority.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's some of it's market driven in the economy right now, kind of forcing that function and people looking like how do we minimize this, or if it's a pushback to sometimes people coming in and they're saying, well, I want this more of a tactical role necessarily the case, but it's certainly the outcome that we're seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so here's my litmus test, right? I think obviously the chief executive officer who runs the organization's C-level position, and under the CEO, there are other what would be classified as executive level positions, right? Mm-hmm. The chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, maybe the chief information officer. And this is where things get interesting. If you're a CISO reporting to the CIO and not the CEO, are you really a C-level executive? I think it's just title only at that point, isn't it?
100%. You're at a VP level now, maybe senior
even
VP
the CIO.
level.
Even the CIO, how many CIOs actually report? Like at large companies, I've seen CIOs who report to the COO or to the CFO, right? And that alone strikes me as strange, right? It's almost like if it's technical that they see it as a cost of business function and it's just pushed off to the side, right? Whereas, the CFO, the chief legal officer, the chief sales officer, like they're fundamentally core to the business, and that is a function that we must have as a core of the executive team. But technical functions, that's the thing that I think and I feel that it's misunderstood, and because it's misunderstood and they don't understand the technology, it's perceived as voodoo science and it's relegated off to the side. Just keep it going, operate it in a box. As long as the function works, I don't want to deal with it. And so I think even for the CIO function, it misses out a lot. I've sometimes seen it for the CTO, right, or a chief product officer kind of pushed down a little bit too, that if it's pushed off and we don't understand it and it's just this function that happens, you're missing out on the opportunity of using it as a force multiplier for the business. You're not fully taking advantage of that executive understanding what's going on in the rest of the business to then give you the opportunity to change the way you're doing things.
Yeah. I think if CEOs and other executives within the organization don't open their eyes soon, there's going to be a lot more of these executives being held accountable, and we're gonna talk about that Wells notice that came out from the folks at SolarWinds, because and Matt, John Frederickson well. He has a great statement that's always rang in my head, where ignorance is no longer acceptable. Now it's just negligence. CEOs can no longer say, "Well, I just don't understand the technology, and I just didn't understand what was happening. I just didn't understand that you needed these controls in place." It's now negligence. And that's been going on for quite a while. Now we're starting to see the effects of that with these type of notices.
Yeah. So here's the interesting kind of precedent that I remember. Sarbanes-Oxley, right? WorldCom, the Enron debacles, right? Guidance comes out that says now the CEO and the CFO are now responsible for financial reporting of the business. So Sarbanes-Oxley comes out, really puts the CEO and the CFO in the hot seat. Like, you've got to sign off on this stuff. You have to report different material impacts to the business from a financial perspective, right? That was a really interesting precedent because it put the CEO and the CFO of public companies on the hot seat, like legal liability if you lie on this kind of stuff. What I would hope to have seen over the years with where we were going with cybersecurity and the risk and what the SEC wants to do with the security expertise on the board is that we would see a similar CEO, CISO kind of sign off on security controls, that it's no longer acceptable for the CEO not to sign off on security control. But we haven't seen that yet, Jason, right? And if we don't, I could debate that the CISO never really becomes this kind of executive level position because they'll never have the authority, the response, or the true responsibility to protect against cyber attacks.
I 100% agree. And this is where intelligent legislation matters, right? We talk about overreaching legislation and it being too much, but this is where common sense legislation plays in, right? We need to have the motivators.
Wait, you said legislation and common sense. I don't know if those two can actually go together.
One would hope they could, right?
Every now and then the stars align, Tyler. Every now and then.
Every now and then. And it's the carrot and the stick. If there isn't any type of incentive or motivating factor for businesses to invest and put the CISO in a leadership role, a true executive leadership role, If there's no motivation behind it, no type of incentive behind it, or legislation supporting it, I don't think we're going to see the needle move.
Why do you think that we are still in this position, though? We talked about this in our previous episode, which is probably a couple weeks ago if you're hearing this, but the fact that we are all technology companies now, and that we have inherent business risk associated with security as well as business revenue, which Jason really wants to kind of harp on, is the fact that you can be a revenue generating business vertical with inside the business. If we've gotten to that point, do we just have all these legacy holdovers of the CISO role being a secondary function? And now we're in 2023 where we should have all of this purview. We make such a big difference. We are a business enabler. We are generating revenue. We are mitigating business risk. And for the most part, we're probably the sole source of driving influence that controls the success of a business. And yet we're still fighting over an operating seat at the table. This has to be a holdover from longstanding priorities, right?
I think, again, it goes back to the technology function. It's seen as a technology function. And I would even argue that the CIO is getting less of a seat at the table moving forward because of the movement to cloud and the lack of legacy IT being as important as it was. But in that system, right, the last 20 years, it's been seen as a cost center. It's been seen as a functional area of the business that it's minutia that has to get done, right? It's not important, and it doesn't fundamentally strategically offer value to the business. We've seen where companies actually utilize their tech functions as strategic drivers for the company, that they excel and they do better. But I still think most companies don't see security. They see it as a check the box kind of function. It's a compliance function, right? And they don't see that it is compelling and it can create business value and be an accelerator.
Yeah. And it's the same struggles that the CIOs had 25, 30 years ago of fighting for that seat at the table. It's the same struggle. But here's the difference. I think that we as CISOs have a better opportunity to get that seat at the table and have it be long-lasting seat at the table. The problem is that we, yes, it's old school thinking, but as a whole, I don't think we've done a good job of ripping ourselves out of that technical mindset either and speaking the language of the business. So again, it's the same struggle the CIOs had 30 years ago. They were having a hard time connecting to the business, having a hard time having those business conversations because they were considered technical. And guess what? They spoke the language of technology. We're in those same growing pains right now.
So there's an interesting book. It's called A Seat at the Table. It's by Mark Schwartz. Has anybody read that book?
No, I haven't.
No. So it's interesting because it's written from a CIO perspective. It's written with the CIO, right? It's not written from as the CISO. But it's a really interesting read because part of the book talks about fundamentally, like we go to that, we go asking for a seat at the table, and we go asking, like, how can we service you, right? And that's been a legacy of IT, right? How can we give the best service? How can we perform a function? How can we do something for you? And if you go with that mindset, it's almost like you're always going with a subservient attitude. And so no one who has a seat at the table is ever going to treat you like you belong at the table. And so it's almost like we need to change our mindset. And that's the focus of one of the chapters of the book, is you need to think about it in a different perspective, is not go and say, like, how can we provide the best service, but go with the business attitude and say, here are the decisions we need to make, and here are the objectives we need to do. And if you want transformation, if you want speed, and you want agility, I can't guarantee you uptime and availability, and I can't guarantee you these things. So are you willing to make that trade-off? And having that fundamental discussion, that having been in that room and thinking about, like, how the chief revenue officer or the chief legal officer, the CFO comes in the room, they're coming at it from that direction, and it's a different mentality. And I think that's part of it, is if we're going in with the attitude that we don't belong at the table, maybe subconsciously, you're never going to get a seat at the table.
And Ben, this is exactly why I talk about the mindset of being able to go to the table and say, we can be revenue generators. We can help drive additional revenue. We can help land additional opportunity, right? Because that's the mentality walking in the door of that executive leadership team. they have the confidence and capability to sit there and say, this is how I'm going to help transform this business. This is how I'm going to help grow this business, right? We need that same confidence. We need that same capability. We need that same style of leadership. But in order to do that, and this is the difference between those other leaders and CISOs who aren't doing this yet, they understand the nuances of business.
Right.
Yeah, 100%.
I'm curious, Jason, if we're talking about the position a little wrong. If I think about the executive that owns security and risk and privacy, isn't that really the executive level position in the organization? Are we thinking about this role too narrowly as just security when it should really be a security, privacy, risk role?
Because isn't that what the CISO is?
But is it? I don't know. But I don't know that it is.
It depends upon the org. But it depends upon the org, right? So some orgs are big enough where they have a separate privacy person, and some orgs aren't, and it's usually the CISO in those organizations that's handling that. I would argue it's going to be hard to have, like, if you think about that table and how big the table is and how many seats are there, it is going to be hard to have a chief risk officer, a chief security officer, and a chief privacy officer that all really have a seat at the table. In that organization, it's maybe the risk officer and maybe the security officers reporting to that person, right? But you need to have the self-awareness to understand where you fit in that org and what you're willing to accept. But if you don't have a risk person and the CISO is not sitting there and the privacy person is really a lawyer, what functionally is getting addressed from a risk? And I've railed a long time against calling it cybersecurity, because foundationally for me, that's only part of the job. That's a silo, right? That's piece of it. But we gravitate these things that are sexy or, carry gravitas. We think they carry a gravitas. Like, we don't talk about asset management. We don't talk about vulnerability management anymore, right? We talk about the operational component of protecting against threats. I think that mentality of, like, it has to be all encompassing and a holistic approach to security. And sometimes it's the non-sexy things that, like, training, right? And security awareness, like those things that can actually move the bubble. It's a different level of discussion. We need to figure out as an industry how to articulate that better. I almost question, is there a need for a professional society of CISOs?
Yeah.
Right. Where we have codes of conduct.
Again, we're in the growing pains, guys. We're still in those growing pains. And like you said, every organization is different. Some organizations may have someone focused on privacy and risk, but the other organization, this is what the CISO has morphed into. The CISO morphed into not only a security professional, but a business resilience professional, a business intelligence professional, a compliance and audit professional, sometimes a legal and HR professional. Like, the role has morphed based on need of the business. And it's morphed.
And it is like CISO is the wrong title. Like, it's Chief Information Security Officer. Is it more, should it be Chief Security Officer, or should it be the Chief Risk Officer? But, like, Chief Information Security Officer is a legacy of reporting to the CIO. And, like, again, I just think we need to be really concrete about how we approach the concept of what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking forward to the second half of this, because we're actually going to, I think we've all agreed that there is a strategic executive role that needs a seat at the table, right? Who has all of these responsibilities that we talked about, needs to be sitting at the table reporting to the CEO. I think we all agree upon that. Whether or not it's the title of CISO or not is debatable. But I'm looking forward to the next segment where we outline all of the responsibilities the CISO, quote unquote, or this role actually has, because it's a massive list.
It is. And that's why I was trying to get my arms around this first thing, is, are we just calling it the wrong thing? Because we look at John Frederickson, right, as an example. I mean, he holds a chief risk officer title. He owns security, but he also has a much broader risk responsibility in his role. And maybe we're just talking about the wrong role being the executive level position that needs to own this. And maybe there is, and this is okay, by the way, there is a chief executive titled TBD for a second, that has VP or director lines under them that are focused more on the security component, maybe the privacy component, maybe the risk components, but they all roll up, and that position is the one that reports to the CEO and is truly the seat at the table.
Yeah. And is that career path for a CISO? Because John's the perfect example. Went from CISO, information security officer, to chief risk officer.
Right. And I think that's what I was really trying to get my arms around with this first segment, Jason, is there a need for an executive level position that owns security? And it sounds like the answer is yes, but it just may not be the existing title that we know of as either chief information security officer or chief security officer, because I put that in the show notes, right? It could be either one. The question is that the right role? Because you've got, here's what I don't like. We've had a proliferation of C-level titles that don't have C-level responsibilities.
Right. It's happening all over the place. Yeah.
It happens everywhere.
Yeah, and it's org dependent, right? So at my last role, I had IT, I had security, and I had privacy. And I would argue that functionally should be a C-level executive. No, I didn't necessarily have physical security, which I think a lot of times causes the friction and the struggle with a chief security officer role versus chief information security officer role. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have physical security, you're not the chief security officer. But who does have responsibility for that at an executive level? It just gets folded under operations. It gets folded under the CFO. That's the challenge. It varies so much on company, dependent upon responsibility.
Right. So I think where we're going to end this segment is we agree that there should be an executive level position that owns at least security, probably some risk and privacy, and that it should not atrophy back into a VP or director level role. What we'll debate next is if that's the case, we could try to name this role. I'm not really curious in naming it more than I am identifying what are the responsibilities of that role, Jason. So I think that's where we'll go next, right?
Love it.
Okay. All right. We're going to take a quick break and then debate the requirement of an executive level security /risk/privacy role. Stay tuned.